All right. Good morning, everybody. Hi, Irfan. Good to see you. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Sebastian Neave. Sebastian is a trustee at the Airey Neave Trust and a director in the disputes practice at GPW, a London-quartered intelligence and investigations firm. A Russian speaker, Sebastian specializes in CIS-related matters, particularly those with a strong political component. I'd also like to thank the Airey Neave Trust for supporting a number of projects those of us at the Soufan Center have been involved in, including a series of written products that we produced this past summer related to radical right-wing extremism. Also, this is the second year the Airey Neave Trust has been a strategic partner for the Global Security Forum, and it is a great pleasure to introduce to you today Sebastian Neave. Sebastian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I should first just correct a slight error in my biography because I'll be in trouble with my new owners otherwise. GPW was bought by a business called JS Held, so I now have bosses in New York. I need to keep happy. Good morning. I'm absolutely delighted to be here, and thank you very much to the Soufan Center for inviting me to say a few words ahead of the next panel. Framing remarks might be quite a grandiose term for what I have to say, but I'm happy to share that despite some iterations suggesting otherwise, I will not be speaking for a full hour. By way of introduction, I am a trustee of the Airey Neave Trust, which is, as Jason suggests, an English charity and one of the partners of the Global Security Forum, and we're very proud to be so. Although my day job is in the field of risk and intelligence consulting, my involvement in the Airey Neave Trust is due to the fact that, as my name might suggest, Airey Neave was my grandfather. Airey Neave was a British lawyer, soldier, intelligence officer, and lastly, politician. His first encounter with extreme ideologies, if I can make a little jump, came when he was about 17, and he was sent by his, perhaps slightly ignorant at the time, parents to go and do a language exchange in Germany, where unwittingly he took part in some early rallies. Those rallies prompted him to come home and join the territorial army. He saw a threat, and he decided that something needed to be done to meet that threat. In the political sphere, he's perhaps best known for having managed Margaret Thatcher's leadership campaign to become the opposition leader and the leader of the Tory party in the 1970s. He then ran her private office and, slightly confusingly to me, decided to accept the only job that he wanted as her spokesman on Northern Ireland, with a particular focus at the time on security issues. This focus cost him his life, and on the eve of her first election as Prime Minister in 1979, he was assassinated in a car bomb planted by an Irish Republican terrorist group as he drove out of the car park underneath the Houses of Parliament. The group was called the INLA, the Irish National Liberation Army, which was itself the paramilitary wing of the Irish Republican Socialist Party, which, by its own admission, was, by its own claim, perhaps I should say, a Marxist-Leninist party. Despite the two extreme ideologies, if I can make the jump, that he faced both early in his life and that he came a cropper to at the end of his life, being from completely diopposed ends of the political spectrum. In his view, extremism was extremism. Following his death, the Airey Neave Trust was established, and for over 40 years it has worked to fund and promote research that contributes in a practical way to the struggle against international terrorist activity. We make research grants to academics and non-governmental research organizations, and I'd like to say that we welcome applications on as diverse a range of subjects and geographies as possible. Over the 4 decades it's been active, the Trust's funding support has contributed to a wide range of subjects as international terror threats have evolved. In the last couple of years, we have applied funding to research projects looking at security threats from the Caribbean to Russia and from Somalia to back home in the UK. I'd be in trouble with my fellow trustees if I didn't also say that in addition to applications for funding, we also accept donations. Separately, in more recent years, the Trust has overseen the award in London of the biannual Neave Book Prize for publications deemed by the judging panel to be the most significant, original, relevant, and practically valuable contribution to the understanding of global terrorism. I'm delighted to say that the first such prize was awarded 6 years ago to one Ali Soufan for his book, The Anatomy of Terror, From the Death of Bin Laden to the Rise of the Islamic State. Not only is it a fantastic book and very deserving winner, but happily for us, its victory put the Soufan Center on our radar, or perhaps more importantly, it put us on their radar. I speak for all our trustees when I say that we are very proud of the resultant partnership with the Soufan Center. As for many others, an element of our recent focus has been the rise of the extremist far-right threat, a subject on which we partnered with the Soufan Center last year. I also happened to recently attend a presentation of a UK parliamentary report published last year on this very subject, and the UK domestic response to the problems of identifying and preventing such threats. My takeaway was, it's not very easy. Now that's the full extent of my expertise on this subject. So I think it's best now if I say a final thank you to the Soufan Center, the Global Security Forum, and make way for the speakers, who I hope have a lot more to say than me. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Sebastian. Again, my name is Jason Blazakis. I'm a senior research fellow at the Soufan Center, and it is my distinct pleasure to bring you into the next session, which is exploring international violent far-right movements and measures taken by states and international organizations. The evolution of the violent far-right movement is of increasing concern to many states and international actors, with iterations of the threat looking different in various regions, even as states seek a collective international response, as was the case with other transnational groups. This session will consider how the threat has evolved globally, as well as measures to address the narratives and financing of these groups. It is my distinct pleasure to also introduce to you the moderator for this panel, Michael Isikoff. Michael Isikoff is an award-winning journalist and best-selling author who joined Yahoo News in 2014 as Chief Investigative Correspondent. He previously served as National Investigative Correspondent for NBC News between 2010 and 2014, and as an Investigative Correspondent for Newsweek magazine between 1994 and 2010. Michael, please come to the floor and introduce your panel, which is like the Los Angeles Lakers on the extremism front. Good to see you.
Good, thank you, Jason. So we've got a great panel here to discuss this issue. I will introduce them and then have them all come up. Let's see, we've got to introduce the right panel here. Jessica Davis is an international expert on terrorism and illicit financing and the author of Illicit Money, Financing Terrorism in the 21st Century. Dr. Bethan Johnson is also an expert on political violence, and she is an Ernest May Fellow at Harvard University. And Maya Mirchandani is an Indian independent journalist, and she's the senior fellow at the Observer Research Foundation and head of the Department of Media Studies at Ashoka University. And finally, we have Irfan Saeed, who is the head of the terrorism unit at OSCE. We're going to ask him to tell us what that is and what it does. And he is formerly a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State at the State Department's Office on terrorism prevention and detention. Panelists, please come on. So lots to talk about here, but I would say, I want to start out, Irfan, with you, because I would say if we were holding this panel on extremism and political violence 5 years ago, we probably would have been talking first and foremost about ISIS. If we were doing it 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we would still be talking about Al-Qaeda. Today, we are talking about violent right-wing extremism. What explains why this is getting so much attention now and what appears to be an increase in the number of such groups and the continued traction that this ideology is getting?
Thanks for the question, Michael. First, let me thank the organizers for putting this event together year after year. They outdo themselves, so big thanks to the Soufan Center and all the work that they do. And of course, honored to be on this great panel with some really true experts. I'm just the guy who's at the international organizations having to answer the question, what exactly do you do? So we'll get to that in a minute. But I think to answer your question, I'll start off with something Noreen said when she opened this conference, is that we're at a perfect inflection point on counterterrorism. And rightfully so, because over the last 20 years, we've been focused on one particular threat. And now that we're coming out of COVID, after we're starting to come back to meet again, we're looking at terrorism in somewhat of a different light. Obviously, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, they're not defeated yet, but they're close to being defeated. And we've done a very good job, I think, globally, to do what we needed to do to ensure that ISIS and Al-Qaeda do not pose the threat that they do. But at the same time, we've seen this rise of this sort of, and I don't want to call it a new threat, and that's something that I think is very important because this is not a new threat. This is a reinvigorated threat. This is an improved threat, if you will. I mean, go back to Oklahoma City in the 90s. Go back to the Breivik attack in 2011, or the attack on the Sikh Gurdwara in Oak Creek, Wisconsin in 2012. I mean, the threat has sort of always been there. Build the bomb in the kitchen of your mom, right? We talked about this a few years ago at these conferences. The great, narratives that ISIS was putting out. Build the bomb in the kitchen of your mom was based on the anarchist cookbook from the 70s. So this threat has always been around. It's sort of like new and improved, if you will. So what I'll do is I'll talk about it in two very different ways. I think the first one is the hyper-focus on Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and the more inclusive far-right movement. And so to answer your question, it's those two reasons why we're talking about this threat all of a sudden. We're talking about 20 years of hyper-focused on Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and all of our tools and all of our resources were focused there. And the change in this far-right movement, they've become far more open. They've become far more inclusive. And the antis have it now. And it's the anti-government, the anti-masking, the anti-COVID. All of these individuals are coming together to form this hyper-new far-right movement.
But just to follow up a little on that, I mean, you're saying that because we were so focused on Al-Qaeda and ISIS, this gave greater space for these movements to get traction. And I'm still not clear in my own mind, like, what's changed? What's spurring it? And one thing you haven't mentioned is authoritarian governments around the world that seem to have taken a somewhat permissive attitude towards them.
Yes, so when you talk about sort of authoritarian regimes, you talk about some of the grievances and the drivers of very traditional violent extremism and terrorism. So that obviously exists, but when you look at the rise, I think this is going in and out. You guys can still hear me, right? Yeah. When you look at the rise of far-right movement, it's actually metastasizing in Western societies, if you will. If you look across the Nordics, if you look in the United States and Canada, the United Kingdom. So it's not necessarily authoritarian regimes that are part and parcel of the issue. But of course, allowing that safe haven, allowing that safe space is always a problem. It's always the place that terrorists and violent extremists need to grow and thrive.
Jessica, you've done a lot of work on the international connections among these groups and their financing. So tell us a little bit about how extensive those connections are, how significant they are to propelling these groups in the various countries that they're operating.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you very much to the Soufan Center for having me here in the Global Security Forum. It's a real pleasure. I think the international connections are difficult to unpack because they're rather diffuse and not all that concrete. So it's a lot about sharing information internationally. It's a lot about sharing propaganda, spreading mis and disinformation throughout the movement. So it's not like the traditional jihadist threat that we're used to talking about, where there's like much more of a very concrete network. It's a much more amorphous connection, which poses serious challenges in terms of countering it. We're generally used to looking at more structured organizations, particularly in their financing. And so when we look at the extreme right, and the violent far right rather, it's much more difficult to sort of think about tackling those networks from a financial perspective. That doesn't mean that we can't do it. I think what it really means is that we need to look at what their activities are and then how we can reasonably be countering that financing. So one of the main things that I look at here is really the propaganda and the spread of propaganda throughout the far right and the extreme right. This is one of the main mechanisms that a lot of groups and movements and even individuals rely on for radicalization. But it's also something that a lot of the propagandists rely on to make money. So a lot of the individuals who are spreading this information are making a lot of money doing it. And this really raises...
Can you give an example of that?
There's a number of different websites that make money by spreading propaganda. I know Bethan will talk about James Mason a little bit. There's a little bit of a financial component to some of the work that he does and the propaganda that he's created. But there's even individuals, I would say, who are not necessarily violent extreme right, but are more just general extreme right, who are facilitators of radicalization, who make money from that activity and who spread a lot of hate and a lot of disinformation and make funds doing it. And this raises an important point when we talk about the extreme right, because we really come up against freedom of expression and people's unwillingness to necessarily restrict speech, which I completely understand. I think that's a very reasonable reaction. What I would say in response to that is people have a right to say the things that they want to say, but they don't have a right to make money from it. So I think we really need to be looking at things like financial deplatforming and preventing people from making money from extremist propaganda as part of how we counter this threat.
One example of how this sort of pernicious ideology crosses international borders is a case that the FBI made a few years ago against a group called The Base, which was a right-wing neo-Nazi group that was operating in various cells around the country, ultimately a group that were practicing militia-type activities in Georgia, were busted by the FBI. A number of people there involved in it were charged with plotting the murder of a journalist who was thought to be sympathetic to Antifa. And it turned out that the recruitment for this group had taken place, or had been conducted by a guy named, I believe, and Bethan will correct me if I get his name wrong, Ronaldo Nazaro, who was a New Jersey prep school kid who ended up marrying a Russian woman and moving to St. Petersburg. And from St. Petersburg, Russia, he recruited these various right-wing cells in the United States. Bethan, you've done some work on this case. Tell us a little bit about it and why it was so disturbing.
Thank you, and thank you to everyone who's here. I'm really excited not necessarily to talk about Navarro. Nobody wants to give him any more space than we need to, but unfortunately, we have to talk about him when we talk about this threat. And it actually intersects well with what Jessica is saying, because one of the things that the base did was raise money and then purchase property in the state of Washington to create training, to essentially fund training camps for this upcoming racial apocalypse that they are hoping to trigger. And so there are financial footprints that one can follow and trace all across the globe. But it is true that Navarro, I apologize as a New Jerseyan on our behalf that he has traipsed the world spreading this message, has been operating in Russia for years, and he's made no secret about it. And this is what is particularly interesting. He has operated on Telegram, posting videos of himself allegedly attending events that are state-sponsored. But he is an interesting case, not only because he is able to propagate his message and encourage violence and fundraising efforts from a different country, but also because of various other links he has to establishments and institutions in the United States. So one of the things that many communities don't like to talk about with regards to Navarro is the fact that he has connections to the United States military and defense infrastructure. And that is an incredibly contentious topic to discuss among many in Congress, in the United States, and elsewhere. We don't want to think of our armed forces as having this problem. And Navarro, as a veteran, wanted to talk about it, wanted to use that experience, wanted to recruit individuals with that kind of training to his organization and then further train them. So the base is a very interesting case study. And I would also say to the question of the sort of globalization of the far right, even the name, the base, is allegedly was selected because it is supposed to be a translation of Al-Qaeda in English, meaning the base. And so it also shared lots of its propaganda and its training recruitment videos with Al-Qaeda and ISIS. So it wouldn't be uncommon to see propaganda or training manuals from the base online actually being just translated directly from Al-Qaeda instances like what Irfan was talking about before. And I think that's an uncomfortable conversation in a series of ways, but Navarro is one case study in many that I look at. I love to look at the individual biographies and study that. So maybe I'll have time to talk about some of my other work, but sure. He's an interesting case study that is still in operation today. And I think that's really critical to discuss, that whilst those raids were taking place and the base has been designated a terror group by many countries, it's not designated, to my knowledge, in the United States, and he is still at large in this space and still interested.
In St. Petersburg, he's still spouting off online.
Yeah.
Right.
And I mean, where he's based in some ways is interesting, but also in our global technological age, far less important than it used to be, because he can communicate with anyone around the world. You don't need to have to meet him in person to connect with him and be recruited by him.
And the the adopting just the name, the base, and the connections and the apparent sympathies with Al-Qaeda from a extremist group on the right like this is pretty striking, I have to say, and it's not something that's got a lot of attention. Just one more beat on this case, because it has fascinated me. The kid in Georgia who was participating in the training that the FBI disrupted, they had actually infiltrated the group, was a teenager in Rome, Georgia. It's northwest Georgia. This is Marjorie Taylor Greene country, for those of you not familiar with the state. But this was a kid who I believe was a high school dropout. He was posting online under the name The Militant Buddhist. And here's something he wrote that got some attention when this case came down. The electrical grid, as well as many other of the system's tentacles that keep the lemming class fat and happy, are extremely weak and easy to target and could even be gotten away with very easily with enough planning and safety precaution. I bring that up because there was a recent report that there's been something like a 71% increase in the number of attacks on electrical power stations. And while not all of them are terrorist related, a number of them are. There was just a big case in Baltimore, the FBI busted, in which a guy, a right-wing extremist who was affiliated with the Adam Waffen, which our panelists are deeply knowledgeable about, were planning an attack in Baltimore that the Bureau said could have taken the entire city down, left it dark. Erwin, what this surge in attacks on electrical power grids? We've spent a lot of time talking about the Russian missiles taking out the Ukrainian grids, but not too much on this. What do you make of it, and how alarming is it to you that we are seeing this spike?
Well, I think it shows us that they're not really focused on the big, large attack. They're understanding that the relevance they can have is getting into the headlines. So this idea of going after electrical grids and critical infrastructure is pretty important. But it's also about attacking where they can attack. So you're also seeing an enormous rise in attack against gatherings of LGBTQ or Asians. You've seen a handful of this attack in the United States just in the last few months. The lone actor ability to get in a car and drive down a crowded street in Nice, or as you saw in Brooklyn, where the sentencing phase is going on right now in that case. So it's just this opportunity, right? It's an opportunity for them to create some headlines, do some damage, without having to go through the raising funds, coordinating with others. I mean, that's important, and they still do it. And they're still trying to ensure that they're operating as a group in some instances, but they don't necessarily always have to operate as a group. And that's what makes our job that much harder, because as law enforcement, as intelligence officials, those are almost impossible to stop.
Go ahead, Jessica,
these attacks
please.
are also about hastening the downfall of modern society. One of the core elements for some of these groups, part of the sort of the so-called accelerationist ideology. So focusing on the energy infrastructure demonstrates to the average citizen, or so they would say, that how vulnerable society is and how much we need to sort of prepare for the collapse of that society. So that's part of that, the targeting selection.
Yeah, I would say,
yeah.
that accelerationism does, and what accelerationism is, the base and others, is this idea that egalitarian societies are fundamentally incorrect. The natural order is one of racial hierarchy, as well as gender hierarchy, LGBTQ, inferiority or subhumanity. So this is the way that they think, and so they believe that ultimately our societies will inevitably collapse. They're just accelerating that. And what that plays into is they're not trying to build a state. All they're trying to do is destroy. That makes it very different. So the fundraising opportunities that are there, the purposes that they're setting out to create are not to do with building anything, but breaking it down, which makes it much more diffuse and much more difficult. And also they play on our fears. The purpose of an attack on an electrical grid or an attack in a nightclub or etc., they target communities because what they eventually want is to trigger race wars or community wars. So they want to make white society so afraid of non-white society and vice versa that they attack each other. And because they believe that inevitably white superiority will win out. So what they're trying to do with the blackout, for instance, is say, okay, I don't know if anyone's seen the film The Purge, for instance, but essentially they're trying to create a society in which when the lights are out, who do you attack? Who are you afraid of? Etc. So that's also why they like communities or groups like Al-Qaeda, because they like when Salafi jihadism attacks because it makes white societies and non-Muslim societies afraid of Muslims, more inclined to attack Muslims or ostracize them, and this cycle of violence continues and continues until it will eventually spin out of control. And it's, in many ways, not the entirety of the far-right ideology by any means. I'm sure Maya will talk about the other end of it, which is when it is much more oriented towards a state-building exercise on the far right. But for some of the extreme groups that are targeting hospitals, infrastructure, community groups, ethnic minorities, the reason they're doing it is to break things. And that makes it very difficult and unlikely to be defeated anytime soon as well, because the natural inclination towards disorder has been existing for a long time. I'm a historian. We've had this not just in the 20th century, but you look, the terrorist organization, the KKK, has been in operation since the Reconstruction era in the United States, and we've never been able to call that a terrorist group, and they still attack today. So I think it's really important to bring those to the fore. But Maya will speak much more to the other side of that spectrum.
Let's bring Maya into the conversation. At the same time, there's been this rise in right-wing extremist groups in the United States, Europe, various places around the world. You've also experienced a rise in right-wing Hindu extremism groups in India. We were talking before also about the role that governments play in either targeting such groups or perhaps facilitating them or taking a more permissive attitude. Tell us what the situation is in India now with right-wing Hindu extremism and how the Indian government is addressing it.
Thank you, Michael, for that question, and thank you to Noreen and the Soufan Center for inviting me to speak on this subject. I think I want to sort of preface my response to you by saying that in general, around South Asia and in that part of the world, what we are calling the far right or right-wing extremism is sort of a factor of identity politics and how it's playing out in different countries, whether it's Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, Sri Lanka. So you've seen a sort of a muscular, identity-based, nationalist, hyper-nationalist politics, which is playing out across these countries. And a rallying point for that kind of politics is religious identity and cultural identity. So in the context of India, the idea that religious extremism manifests across different faiths. In fact, you're asking about Hindu extremism, but just last week, we've had a situation in the northern state of Punjab where a Sikh extremist has once again come to the fore. And these are sort of, they're ethno-national, they're religious, they're cultural. There's sort of an intersectionality that's taking place. I think when it comes to the idea of religious extremism, there is a recognition amongst the security establishment that things could get out of hand. We've seen what happened with the Islamist, jihadist movements that have recruited from India and managed to recruit not as successfully in other parts of the world, but they've had their share of recruits. So how does that feed into a kind of counter-radicalization and a counter-extremism, which is what the identity plays a role in? In the last year, we have seen the diaspora become very involved in fueling a kind of majoritarian narrative that again feeds into this. So for example, Hindu communities in, again, New Jersey, I'm sorry to say, celebrated the demolition of Muslim homes in North India and issued calls for genocide amongst a small diaspora community. It would be a stretch for us to assume that this has state sanction. But I think it's fair to say that the kind of politics that we're seeing play out in India today allows a safe space, someone used the word safe haven, allows a safe space for this sort of position to be expressed far more freely without threat of sanction. The same thing happened in the UK, in Leicester in September 2022. A victorious procession after India beat Pakistan in a cricket match essentially heckled Muslim populations in Leicester, and these were masked men in balaclavas and, chanting Hindu slogans, in a sense also demeaning the faith and demeaning the practice of the faith. There were concerns raised in the UK over something like this. But again, I think the fact is that because it's premised in a kind of muscular identity politics, there is a resistance towards clubbing what's happening in the global south, in South Asia, with a general sort of understanding of what far-right extremism is. So countries like India or Sri Lanka, for example, are far more comfortable with the terminology of white supremacy or neo-Nazi movements than racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism. So, and this is a conversation for multilateral fora, this is a conversation for the CTC, this is a conversation for the United Nations, to say, how do you get states which have a problem, but also have governments that have sort of come from this kind of politics and this kind of ideology to act against what is clearly an act of violence. And I think that's the challenge, it's a crossroads.
Look, in the United States, I think it was 2017, we had the Charlottesville rally,
Right.
whatever it was, and Donald Trump says there are, good people on both sides, which was something that really registered with a lot of these groups, that this was the President of the United States seeming to give permission for these groups to do what they were doing. Now, in India, you have Modi is a Hindu nationalist who has support from a lot of these extremist Hindu groups. Is there an analogy here between Trump and the rise in right-wing extremism in the United States and Modi and what's been happening in India with Hindu nationalism?
Well, Trump got a lot of support from a lot of the diaspora. I mean, the Republican Hindu groups sort of rallied together and raised money for his campaign, brought him to India, had him engage with the Indian media, and continue to do it. So there is a linkage between, in the UK, for example, conservative Hindus have supported the Tories and some of their policies and their politics. So there is always a linkage between conservative politics and the kind of Hindu nationalism that is again premised on the supremacy of the majority identity and the majority identity of a country having a say, having the say. Prime Minister Modi comes from the BJP, which is a party, sort of the political wing of the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, which is the Hindu nationalist, ideological, cultural body in India, and the BJP is its political sort of offshoot. So yes, his politics and the BJP's politics is very much about ensuring that the Hindu majority of India is not subservient or suppressed by what is popularly termed in India as minority appeasement politics. So the argument of this both sides, for example, is that Hindu-Muslim tensions in India predate what's going on today. So let's not look at it as terrorism. Let's look at it as social and political violence, not any kind of extremism. And we've had a history of this that dates back to before the partition of India and Pakistan. That's one. The second is that because these are incidents of social and political violence that are provoked or have a factor of religious identity involved, there are enough provisions within the current legal framework in India to deal with them as hate crimes, crimes of discrimination, and possibly investigate any other motivations. So there is a deep
Do they
resistance.
prosecute such cases?
They do
Hate
prosecute
crimes
such cases.
against Hindu nationalists?
Well, they prosecute cases on the basis of a murder or a crime or a lynching. Our legal system is a topic for another panel because our cases take often 10, 15, 20 years to adjudicate in the courts. But I mean, can I go in and file a first information report and ask the police to investigate it? Yes, I can. Can I be confident that the police will investigate it fairly is another question altogether. Okay. So I think that's the issue.
Erwin, you used to work at the State Department. The State Department designates organizations as foreign terrorist organizations, FTOs, I believe, is the acronym. 3 years ago, the State Department designated the Russian Imperial Movement, which I believe was the first time a right-wing extremist group was designated by the State Department. That was under Donald Trump. How many has the Biden administration designated since it took office?
Well, I'm going to defer that question to Jason
No, but you
Blazakis
know the
because
answer.
Jason has.
The answer is zero. Right. Thank you.
Zero.
And why is that?
I think part of the issue is that, as I talked about earlier, you're having this sort of diffuse movement of far right. How do we define it? Something Maya's talking about here is a very important thing. How do you define far right, REM-V? Where's the focus? I mean, REM-V was a term that came from the United States after the El Paso shooting from a couple of years ago, and we had to scurry to find a way to define it and then respond to it. Because we can talk all day long about what the threat is, but at the end of the day, we need to find ways as government officials, when I was at the State Department, and now at the OSCE in a multilateral organization, it's not just about talking, it's finding ways to counter it. And I think the inability to define it, the inability to put it in the circles and the squares that we needed to fit into, because...
Explain this, because I have to say, I don't get it. I mean, if we can link these groups to acts of political violence and extremism, why is it so hard to designate? We designate plenty of, Muslim extremist groups as terrorist organizations. Why is it so hard to do it against right-wing groups?
The short answer, and again, I'm looking at Jason because he's the expert on this, but the short answer is the authorities and the laws that we have on the books are not really favorable to designating domestic terrorist organizations.
Well, I'm talking about foreign groups here, not domestic.
So the foreign groups that we know are foreign terrorist organizations are designated as such. The base, the Proud Boys, they're all U.S. based, and by law you can't designate them.
Right.
So that's why you're seeing these designations from Canada, from the United Kingdom, from a lot of these organizations, because they're designating the United States-based organizations. But in the U.S., we can't do that. But the conversation, sorry to cut you off, but the conversation has always been, how do we get past the designations and the prescribed organizations? How do we get past that conversation? There's lots of tools in the toolbox that we can use, and something I think we can talk about.
Jessica, you wanted to weigh in on this.
Yeah, I also want to name drop Jason Blazakis' work. But we worked together on a project with the Soufan Center for the Airey Neave Trust on designations of foreign terrorist organizations and the extreme right. And Jason's paper really had a good solution in it to a certain extent. It was a fairly elegant solution to focus on the foreign connections of these organizations. So I think we saw it in New Zealand where they designated the American Proud Boys. So there's nothing that would prohibit the United States from designating the Canadian Proud Boys, for example. So really to emphasize the international linkages as something of an immediate workaround to this lack of designation capability.
So you would like to see the Biden administration's State Department step up and start designating some groups where they have so far not done so?
I think that there's some utility to designating these groups as terrorist organizations, both from a messaging perspective to indicate to individuals that, okay, maybe we haven't designated the domestic version of this group because we cannot, but we still consider it to be a terrorist organization. So I think that's very useful for a population to understand that. And then the practical implications of this become that banks become much less interested in providing financial services to individuals associated with these organizations, making their operations, even individually, much more challenging.
Irvin, just to come back to you, the State Department doesn't just designate foreign terrorist organizations, they also designate countries as state sponsors of terrorism. We were talking before about the Russian imperial movement. We brought up that guy, Nazaro, with the base, who may have had some state assistance, or at least its permissibility for him to operate. Why aren't we more aggressive in designating countries as state sponsors of right-wing terrorism?
So, I mean, there's two parts to that question. One is, are we designated countries as state sponsors of terrorism? The answer is yes. As far as on the far-right movement...
And sometimes with pretty loose standards. I mean, Cuba was put back on the list, right? For what? Some vague connections to the FARC in Colombia.
But I think when it comes to the designation of state sponsors in the far-right movement, we have to look at the legal authorities. We have to look at how they're actually perpetuating acts of violence. And look, there's no lack of trying. You know, in the conversations I've been at the State Department, there are conversations going on. How can we overcome some of the legal thresholds to get to this state sponsorship? But at the end of the day, I would argue that that's just one part of the conversation. There needs to be more discussion about the tools we have to counter the far right. And the statement I made earlier about how they're sort of, it's a new and improved or reinvigorated, they're operating differently. And the way government works is we want to put them into these buckets and then use the tools. So the anti-terrorism tools here, or the organized crime tools here, or the drug trafficking, you know, we don't like to combine them. And what this new sort of improved far-right movement is doing is that they're taking all of the bits and pieces of all of the different types of violence and crime and putting them together. And to be honest, as government, we're sort of confused as to what tool can we use to go after them.
Bethan, you had a
Yeah,
point you wanted to make here.
I did want to interject, and I think that it's important to recognize that it is a great thing that the United States has designated or recognized at least the existence of right-wing terrorism in some way by acknowledging the Russian imperial movement, but that's not the only group that could have been designated. That is one group. So before we pat ourselves on the back, or the former administration pats itself on the back and says, well, Biden hasn't done anything, they could have gone much further. And there are skeptics in the room, at times myself one of them, that did say part of the reason for that designation was, what is the first word in there? Russia. And this designation was taking place at a time in which there was a lot of conversation about Trump's links to Putin and the Russian administration. And so some people thought it was a mask to distance Trump from the Russian administration and to sort of create a veil of cover around
Are you suggesting there was not sufficient evidence to designate the Russian imperial movement?
I'm not suggesting that, but I'm suggesting that there can be two motivations happening at once. And if we want to really laud an administration for its approach to tackling right-wing terrorism, you could say, okay, well, it took one step, but it could have taken many more steps along that way. So we saw, for instance, the designation of Fear Creek Division in the UK. That was operating all around the world. It was run out of Estonia by, surprisingly enough, a 13-year-old boy. We don't know his name or much about him because he is actually not of, obviously, age to have his name released to the press, but that was another entity that could have been designated, Sonnen Creek Division, the base. We could have had many more conversations about right-wing terrorism under Trump that we didn't. Obviously,
but why are you saying under Trump? Biden has been president for more than 2 years now.
Yes, so
let's talk about right now.
Yes, so what I was then going to go on to say is, and I am disappointed that the current administration hasn't taken up that mantle and done much more with it. I think that the promises that happened around the inauguration before, when President Biden was president-elect, had given many people more hope that this designation process would be made much more rapid, much more transparent. So I am disappointed in that. But I do think it's important to acknowledge that while the U.S. has designated one group, and it's arguably somewhat ironic that it's Trump who said both sides in this Charlottesville thing,
Right.
It's not as if RAM was the only group it could have designated and should have designated.
Along those lines, one group that a few years ago we would have talked and asked questions about why it hasn't been designated is the Azov Brigade in Ukraine. Not too many people want to talk about that in the United States right now, but there were plenty of people trying to call attention to the neo-Nazi ties of this Ukrainian group. Did it come up when you were at State Department, and were you seriously considering designating the Azov Brigade?
I mean, look, the longstanding policy of the State Department is never to talk about internal, deliberations, and so Jason's now smirking at me because I get to say that rather than him. But look, every conversation's on the table, and I can say this. We at the State Department we did share the disappointment that we're not further down the road when it comes to designating more and more right-wing, far-right, Ren V actors in this space. Everything is on the table, and we're looking at every possible designation. It's just getting over those legal authorities is part and parcel of some of the issues.
Jessica, should the Azov Brigade be designated?
I think we need to focus on international cooperation on our designations and listings. I think the utility of one state designating a group it can be useful, but if states all act in concert, that's where we start to see a lot more utility. So if it needs to be designated by the United States, then it needs to be designated across the Five Eyes and with as many possible countries, because these groups...
Okay, should all of the Five Eyes and Western Europe designate the Azov Brigade?
I think there would be some utility to that.
Really? Yeah. I don't see too many people sort of speaking up on this issue right now.
I don't think it's necessarily the top of the list in terms of what should be designated. I think that there are bigger fish in the sea to be...
Such as?
Well, I think all of the groups that Canada has listed could be designated internationally, so things like Proud Boys, Adam Waffen, the Base, what Bethan was saying about the various different divisions. All of those things, we don't have an international consensus yet on this, and that's one of the things that needs to develop in this space.
Well, on that front, there's the question, the long-standing one, is whether we need a domestic terrorism law in the United States, because we don't have one, and that the question is, does that hinder or tie the hands of the FBI in trying to track these groups? Thoughts on that issue, Bethan?
Yeah, so one of the things that I did, I used to be based out of the University of Cambridge in the UK, was I would work with law enforcement as an expert witness in cases, and it's a very different threshold around what can be considered terrorism and what is a terrorist offense there. And I think that it's difficult to recommend anything in terms of what should be domestic terrorism legislation until you have a sort of national reckoning around what you're willing to police and criminalize. So in the United States, for instance, issues of free speech and free association are somewhat different than in other countries. So unless you're willing to begin a conversation on those issues and where the limits of speech are, where the limits of association are, putting laws in place around domestic terrorism may not be as helpful as we think it could be. So, I mean, I stand by all the cases that I have been a part of in terms of terrorism-related incidents, but I was working in a different context. It worked for the United Kingdom because that is what their society's social contract says in terms of how you're allowed to associate. Whether or not the United States is comfortable with that is a very different conversation, and I think we have to have the first sort of hurdle met before we put ourselves too in front of our skis, as it were. But maybe Maya can also speak to that, because it's a different scenario in terms of what the names, right? You're not calling it domestic terrorism, it's not REMV either, but like that context might be interesting to bring in, and how prosecutions work, because you mentioned that before.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to come into that in any case, because we have something called the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, which is operable in India. And that is our primary anti-terrorism act. It's been subject to various amendments over the last, it was sort of enacted in 1967, but it's been subject to various amendments over time. And there were definitions, and there were clearly defined terms under the original UAPA about what constitutes terrorism within the Indian Dominion. And there was religious extremism, there was ethno-national extremism, there was left-wing extremism, and there was narco-terrorism. These were the 4 original categories. Now, each one of them have kind of expanded and begun to intersect with each other, because religious extremism could be Islamist extremism, it could be Hindu extremism, which is what the previous Home Minister in the UPA regime in 2009 called it, much to a huge uproar in Parliament, or it could be any other faith that is practicing a militant form of its faith. But India's experience with terrorism has been really actually very much about ethno-national secessionist movements that are that create insurgent groups that operate against the Indian state, right? So the Kashmiri groups that operate in Jammu and Kashmir, or the Khalistani groups, or groups that operate for secession from India in the northeast, Nagas, the United Liberation Front of Assam, groups like that. What's been worrying, actually, in the context of the anti-terrorism framework in India is one of the most recent amendments of 2019. And that amendment actually allows individuals to be designated as terrorists, as opposed to those with affiliations or memberships to these groups. So again, while you all are talking about domestic terrorism and naming individuals and why they don't fit certain categories, the conversation in India is how that kind of amendment and that kind of change could be also misused by the state. Because how do you determine this individual is a terrorist? What is the benchmark to make that determination in a political climate where dissent is, is an issue? Right. So there are various sort of intersections over here. It's not. I know you might think I'm sort of going all over the place, but it's not easy to give a straightforward answer to this question, because while, yes, there should be a legal framework that is very clear about who is a terrorist, what ideology do they subscribe to, how do they perpetrate the act of violence that deems them a terrorist. In the kind of climates that we're in, there are very different methods at play. And just as an example of that again, far-right white supremacist or neo-Nazi groups in Europe and America have access to the kind of arms and ammunition that no group in India or Sri Lanka or Bangladesh would have. Those guns just don't exist. So when the conversation on terrorism and sort of Hindu terrorism or religious extremism comes back at these countries, or Buddhist extremism, the question is, why are lone gunmen in America not being called terrorists? They're walking into nightclubs, they're opening weapons in schools, in shopping malls. Why aren't they terrorists?
Yeah. Because we don't have a domestic terrorism law, so we can't prosecute them for being terrorists. We prosecute them for committing crimes.
But I'm saying that's the question that sort of comes back at sort of the world's leading liberal democracy. So
I can come in on this real quick, because look, as a former prosecutor, I can tell you that the more tools we have to prosecute, the better. You're right, there is no domestic terrorism statute. There's a definition on the books, but there's no criminal sanctions associated with it. If you ask the prosecutors, could you still prosecute cases? Absolutely. There are underlying crimes that exist. So the material support for terrorist or terrorist organizations is a catch-all. So when you can't prosecute, or you don't want to prosecute for some of the underlying crimes, you can go to the catch-all. There is no catch-all on the far-right REMV side.
Right. So we've talked a lot about designations and laws and prosecutions, but regardless of what governments may or may not do on that front, the fact is that a very pernicious, racist, anti-Semitic, neo-Nazi ideology is still with us and is still being spread every day on social media. And, you know, we can designate all we want, but there's still that underlying problem. So to wrap up, I'd like everybody's thoughts on how to address the underlying problem here of the perpetuation of, you know, this really sick ideology. And Jessica, why don't you start first?
Sure. So, you know, my focus really remains on the countering the financing of a lot of these activities. Today I pushed out a newsletter to my followers about looking at what our current tools are and how they might apply in the context of violent right-wing extremism. And I think a lot of the tools that we have exist only need a bit of a tweaking to really be applicable here. But three that I'd really focus on is really making it unprofitable to spread propaganda. So focusing on, you know, getting people financially deplatformed. This means, you know, maybe they can say what they want on social media or on platforms, but they can't profit from it. The second one is really about increasing civil liability for some of these propagandists. So, you know, internationally, we need to be exploring modes of liability on the civil side that can hold people accountable for the things that they're saying and the things that they're advocating. And then the last one is, of course, sanctioning a lot of these actors as much as possible so that we can exclude them from the international financial system. This isn't going to solve the problem, but it's going to introduce friction into their ability to spread their propaganda, spread their message.
Maya?
So I think the issue of how the sort of ideology spreads on social media is a huge problem. Before our panel started, I was actually showing Irfan today's latest storm in a teacup controversy in New Delhi. The US Embassy recently hosted a group of sort of women for International Women's Day and had them speak about equality and gender equality. And one of the people there is a very well-known local radio station DJ named Saima. She's an Indian Muslim, and the Indian Embassy has posted a little clip of hers on its Twitter. The US Embassy has posted a little clip of hers on its Twitter handle in New Delhi, and she has been trolled relentlessly since yesterday for being a foreign agent. And propaganda rags aligned to the right have essentially ripped her apart from the morning. I mean, this is something that we live with. So again, another intersection that over here between patriarchy and the right wing, because conservative right wing ideologies are also deeply patriarchal in nature. They're sort of hyper-masculine and deeply patriarchal. So, you know, the fact is that this conversation in India has been happening for a while. When we started looking at the impact of hate speech, it started with hate speech that was directed towards political opponents, towards journalists, and towards Muslims. That's kind of spread because the argument is always, oh, the other side is doing the same thing. But I think the numbers stack up very differently for that argument to hold. Tech companies in India are being subjected to local laws as well. And we've seen increasing instances of platforms, particularly like Twitter, comply with government orders to actually hide tweets, take down tweets. They're kind enough to send you a note saying that we've been asked to withhold your tweet because of a government order. You know, so now, is it being used towards a political end, or is it being used to stop hate that foments violence? That is open to interpretation, unfortunately. We're in a space where anything that is not liked by the state could potentially fall under the category of problematic messaging. Yeah, so I mean, should platforms be doing that with governments? I think that, again, that's a whole different panel for you, Noreen, to plan.
I'm getting
But-
signals we're out of time, but just to wrap up, Bethan, in 30 seconds, can you give us your answer that will solve this entire problem? Oh, we do have a few more minutes. No, you have more than 30 seconds. You have 2 minutes.
Obviously, I can. In 2 minutes, God, I'll solve this problem and way more. No, I would say that it's an interesting conversation to talk about social media. I think it's part of a problem. Social media is the amplification of conversation and communication. I study at the moment someone named James Mason, who was radicalized in the 1960s as a teenager. He has spent his life radicalizing teenagers to this day. And he was radicalized himself at school, essentially, through conversations his family had, etc. And what we see in many cases, even through today, is that's still taking place. We want to think it's that stranger danger that's happening. Some adult is talking to your kid, and that is the person who is tempting them towards this nefarious neo-Nazism. But in fact, quite frequently, it starts much closer to home. It might not be that you are espousing to your children or to your nieces and nephews, etc., neo-Nazi propaganda, but when you start talking in us and them rhetoric or perpetuating certain stereotypes and ideologies, you're actually laying the groundwork. And I think that it's really critical to have conversations around education and how we raise children, how we also communicate between each other as adults in sort of complex, ever-changing society. These groups work basically in public, and they work on our fears. So what we have to do as a civil society is have honest and earnest conversations about what we're afraid of and why we're afraid of it in order to combat the problem more robustly. Because until we're really earnest about those issues, I think we're not going to get anywhere near as far as we think we are by just telling Twitter what to take down, or and that's not to sort of besmirch financial elements or otherwise, or designations. If we don't have conversations interpersonally, we're still going to have this problem in 100 years.
Irvin, final thoughts.
Yeah, we can't just continue to vilify social media companies and the internet. The internet's not the problem, but like you said, it's an amplification of what's going on at the local level. We have a lot of tools in the toolbox. We've been having this conversation over 20 years. We've been at this forum for over 5 years, articulating what those tools are. We have our traditional preventing and countering violent extremism tools to build tolerance. We have our countering terrorist finance tools to stop the sale of merchandise and MMA concerts, MMA events and concerts and the like. We have tools to protect critical infrastructure, so electrical grids, houses of worship, places of gathering. And we have the tools to counter terrorist use of the internet. But I think there it's more about digital literacy and media literacy, getting the kids to understand what they're looking at online. Something the FBI said yesterday, the propaganda is growing globally and it's skewing younger. And so we need to get better at also targeting some younger audiences with digital media and literacy, all of which the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, does.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. We'll have another panel on what your organization actually does. But anyway, I want to thank our panelists for a really illuminating discussion, and thank you all for listening.